welcome everyone to our talk. And I think Carol and I both feel very honored that you're here at all, that people have come to this conference. We understand what a challenging moment this is, and that you're willing to open your minds to think about one more thing and not have your head explode. That seems like a really wonderful thing, and I commend you very much for it. Oops. Here we go. So I'm Elizabeth Norman, a publisher of Connecticut Explored, which is a public history magazine. We've been at many CCSS conferences. We've really enjoyed being there and talking with teachers and learning from you all about what you need and what you're looking for. We, of course, have a passion for having Connecticut's history infused into the curriculum. And we really, if you read Connecticut Explored, you see that we have a very broad interest in representing all of the different kinds of peoples who live in Connecticut and have made it what it is. So we started off with a third grade book called Where I Live, Connecticut, which we developed with two curriculum coordinators, Ashley Callan from West Hartford and Melanie Meehan from Simsbury. And that was really designed by them. It was a wonderful collaboration and has been widely accepted for third and fourth grade. Which has been wonderful. So then we marched on to fifth grade, and I was very, very fortunate to have Carol introduced to me, and I guess I was passionate enough about this project that she signed on and became very passionate about it as well. And again, so I want to reflect that this is very much a collaboration between the history field and the education field. Like Carol is the go-to person on the education side. And I just am so grateful for working with her. She's just been a wonderful and has buoyed me in those moments where I thought I was crazy to be trying to pursue this. And we're going to introduce this book, which came out a year ago. My timing could be better, but you know, we do what we have to do. And I'm going to kind of introduce you to the book itself and what it's all about. And she's going to talk very specifically about the curriculum and how that's designed, particularly strongly around inquiry. Do you want anything, Carol?
No, I think you hit it all for now.
Okay. So this is what we're going to talk about. We're going to introduce the Venture Smith's Colonial Connecticut. I always like to show it's a book, it's a website, it's a beautifully designed book. You know, we're going to show you more, but just because virtually it's hard to actually see what we're talking about. We're going to try to tell you why you should be excited to teach it. I said to Carol, is that like overreach? Or she laughed, but we're going to try to get you excited about it. Of course, talk about the nuts and bolts, how it fits with the state's ELA and social studies standards, why it's a great opportunity for inquiry, and you know, give you a little taste about what kids have said about it. They're the test. We piloted it in a couple of districts, and just touch a little bit at the end on teaching difficult history. We're not gonna. You could of course do whole conferences and should be doing whole conferences on that very topic, but just to say that there are some resources for supporting that. So, oops, I'm going the wrong direction. Why am I going the wrong direction? Okay, sorry, it's my trackpad. So this is a complete resource ready to use, right out of the box. Absolutely everything you need for distance learning or in classroom. It's a 108-page book, as I showed you before. It's available in print and online, and the online version tracks exactly to the print version. So if you have a hybrid classroom, you have some kids online, you have some kids in the classroom, or they're switching back and forth, you can always say, and now we're going to turn to page 43, and it's the same page 43 online as it is in the book. We specially commissioned illustrations by including our cover image by Connecticut artist Michael Borders, because there are no images of Venture Smith that are known. We have illustrations, maps, charts, glossary, bibliography, and a curriculum. And today I'm going to talk a bit about this primary source library online, which I've, in this coronavirus work from home, I've really been building out quite a bit, and I'm pretty excited about. And the book is low cost. We're kind of offering professional development on demand or at request. And if you go to our exhibit hall, we have a little flyer you could print out about Venturesmith. We're also offering a free sample issue of the magazine, and we have Teach Educator discounted subscriptions to the magazine. You'll find some other resources for other grades, 8th grade, high school, and more about where I live at the 3rd and 4th grade level. Why is this not working the way I want? My arrows won't advance this. So, wasn't quite expecting this to be my next slide, but what this slide is telling you, and this is the meat of this discussion today, is so Venturesmith's Colonial, Connecticut is a book that foregrounds the first person narrative of Venturesmith, who is a real live person, lived in Colonial, Connecticut, published his narrative in 1798. So it's really exciting because it foregrounds this person's voice of color in the colonial, the founding of Connecticut. He's really here in the second half of the colonial period. He's enslaved in West Africa as a young boy, brought here, of course, against his will. He survives the Middle Passage and grows up to be, and then self-emancipates, buys his family. When he dies in 1805 or 1808, I've forgotten already, he is a successful farmer, businessman, trader. And so the story arc, the long arc of his story, is really what we call a true story of freedom. And there's so much packed into his narrative that I always say this is not a book about slavery. And when I say that, I'm not saying that to minimize slavery in any way, because that part of the story is very much there, and he tells us about that. But he tells us about so much more. He tells us a ton about the colonial economy. And his story, I just also wanted to point out, is really a story about agency, identity, resistance, struggle, success. And so the arc of his experience tells us a lot about colonial Connecticut, tells us, and it really provides kids of different identities with a very inspiring story, and one that is really one that everyone can find some inspiration in. But he is here in the second half. He arrives here in the second half of the colonial period. So we then back it up to fill in the first 100 years. And, beginning with Connecticut before the English and the Dutch arrived, when the Native Americans are here. And so this book enables kids to really learn about the founding of Connecticut from these three very important perspectives, these three important groups of people who each have their own story and trajectory, clearly intertwined, but very different. And so there's just the beginning, the inkling or at least they introduce the idea that Connecticut is not a monolithic place. It is a diverse place. It's not as diverse as it gets later, of course, in the 19th century. But this really opens up, I think, kids' minds to understanding, well, a lot of important things. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But at the very least, that there are different perspectives. There are different peoples here who have different, whose stories of the founding of Connecticut are intertwined, but very different. And the book really seeks to show the agency of all of these groups, how Native Americans resisted this onslaught of colonial settlement. And of course, as I mentioned, Venture's own story is uplifting and illustrates resistance throughout. And very importantly, I think one of the things that I found inspiring about his story is his sense of his own identity from his childhood in Africa, and the values and the culture that are instilled in him in his childhood there is really a thread that stays with him through his entire life. And that's just, I think that's just a beautiful part of this story. Obviously, there's a lot of challenging parts of this story too. So again, I do not mean to minimize this in any way. Oh man, I'm sorry. I just don't know quite how to do this. Going backwards. Okay, So how it fits into the standards, and we created this around the grade 5 frameworks, but we understand that a lot of school systems are using this. They might use this curriculum in upper grades as well. You know, not every school district does the same, but it starts, at least it's sort of based in the grade 5 frameworks. And I don't know if Carol, you want to talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Um, I want to expand a little bit on that, just to say that one of the one of the things that sort of was presented as the Connecticut most recent frameworks were rolled out is that although these are suggested, they are not a mandate. We don't really mandate how curriculum unfolds. And so as we really started working on the curriculum for this, we realized that we needed to make the curriculum accessible for anywhere from grade 4 to grade 8. I would say it would be a little bit challenging for fourth graders, but could be done with scaffolding. But it's definitely very appropriate to do with middle school kids as well. So you'll see that the standards come out of the grade 5 frameworks because that's where early U.S. history is in the frameworks. But when you get to the actual curriculum, you'll see that it is really appropriate for a variety of grade levels. And we actually piloted it at both grades 5 and grade 7 to make sure that that was the case, and had a lot of success with it in both grade levels.
And anyone that might, in any towns that might be working with the Witness Stones project, which is a project that came out of Guilford, where they are having eighth graders research enslaved people in their towns. Really interesting project. This is a really good contextual document or opportunity for that work. Or if it's really done in fifth grader. So really sets kids up with the context for doing that kind of primary research or work in the later grade. Oh my gosh, I changed the slide. All right. I'll give this to you, Carol, as well.
Okay, so we actually wanted it to fit with both the social studies standards and the ELA standards. And at this point, I will make the disclaimer that I was a high school English teacher. And although my career as a curriculum director was K-12, all subject areas, I have worked really closely with the ELA standards over the years, as well as the social studies standards. So for the ELA standards, we really wanted to look at a couple of different things. One is that because the book is set up the way it is, and we're going to talk more about that in a minute, there are really two types of nonfiction reading that are happening here. One is the personal narrative of Venture Smith, which is his own story, as Elizabeth said, told in his own voice. And the other is just straight informational text. The last part of the book is Connecticut history from an informational perspective. So there are opportunities for kids to look at personal narrative and in sort of a memoir form, and then informational text, straight textbook kind of reading. So it's also a great tool for teaching text features. Elizabeth's going to show you a little bit of what the kinds of graphics are that are in here, but there are just a ton of text features. And I know that when I was teaching a strategic reading class to kids that were struggling in high school, the first thing I would say to them is, well, how do you use things like the headings and the captions and the graphics to help you understand? And they would go, well, I don't look at those things. I just look at the words. And so one of the things we wanted to do in this curriculum was really kind of bring forward those text features that really do help kids with comprehension. You want me to?
Yeah, I haven't get,
So,
keep going.
and we showed you we'll show you in more detail the social studies standards later. One of the other things that I was really conscious of when I was starting to work on this curriculum is that we really wanted the focus of it to be inquiry. So the summative assessment, which we'll look at a little bit later, is a full inquiry using the inquiry dimensions of the social studies framework And the inquiry obviously hangs around that dimension two content of the social studies frameworks, but you would be doing a disservice to this curriculum if you didn't do the summative inquiry, which gives kids an opportunity to explore all different kinds of things.
So the book is set up in 4 sections, and sections 1 and 2 are Venture Smith's narrative as published in 1798. I did revise it for grade level reading, and I did something that I haven't seen done before, but I'm hoping is very effective, which is in order to kind of bring it down to grade 5 reading level, I left some sections out. I shortened it a little bit, but I paraphrased certain sections and certain passages. But what was important to me was that students would know when they were reading Venture's exact words as published in 1798 and when they were reading my paraphrased words. So his words are provided in bold, and my words, paraphrased words, are just in regular type. And that's an important thing to point out to kids, because that's not kind of normally what bold means. But the other important thing, though, is I strictly paraphrased. I did not add, and I did not particularly novelize. I'm a historian. I'm not a historical novelist. So while I had one teacher who was kind of, reading and consulting with us, not consulting, but sort of giving input, she's like, well, could you add some dialogue? I was like, no, I cannot add dialogue because I'm a historian. If he didn't say it, it is not in here. And it was very important to me, especially as a white person. I'm not representing what Venture Smith, an African-American from hundreds of years ago, what he might have been thinking or feeling. And some of the comments that kids had said in the pilot were like, oh, I wish there was more about this, or I wish he had said that. And I was like, yeah, me too. I mean, welcome to history. We often are wondering we have a lot of questions that aren't answered. And you have to really, that provides a lot of opportunities for thinking about what you're reading. But if he did not say it, it is not in here. The parts, so the first part is part in Africa. It's a short part. And then the second part is his time growing up and through adulthood and freedom in Connecticut. Then we back it up and go back to the beginning. Part 3 is the beginning of colonial Connecticut, particularly brought the Native American story into the book and the colonial economy. And part 4 is more information specifically about slavery in Connecticut. And so we've certainly had people say, well, you should have put that part 3 first. And initially, actually, I think I had that part first because, again, as a historian, I tend to think kind of chronologically. But I think it was Carol who said, well, we really should put Venture Smith first. And I really agreed with that because, again, symbolically and importantly, we are foregrounding his voice in this story. So it was very important to put his story first. But as Carol will talk about, we did also think about how this could be used kind of as a modules or with some flexibility so that maybe you choose to start with part 3 because you'd like your kids to have more context leading into his story. Or maybe you decide, as we did, to start with Venture Smith's story to kind of get them really engaged and captivated with a real life person story. And that, in fact, a lot of the kids said, they just really connected with him as a real person in Connecticut who lived this life. So that's how it's set up. I don't have too many slides. I had a few more, but about some of the text features. But this is a 2-page spread in the book, and this sort of says a couple of different things. First of all, Venture talks about the money that he has, and he's buying and selling things in dollars. He means Spanish dollars. He has Portuguese coins, Johannes. I spent a lot of time researching this. I went down some very deep rabbit holes looking for how this whole colonial economy worked. And it's just a reminder that there were no centralized banks at this time. There's no, the pound, this is a British colony, the pound is officially the money, but the British government had kept particularly pounds scarce because they wanted all the trade going back to England. So you have a lot of different kinds of money, lots of different kinds of money circulating. Portuguese coins, Johannes. He has coppers. He has lawful money. He has old tenor. I mean, it is confusing. And here are some examples. And so I provide a little bit of, instead of dollars and cents, which is what we have, of course, after Connecticut becomes a state and the United States becomes its own country, then, what that can be confusing. So I've tried to fill in some information. Ways to buy and sell in colonial America. Here's a chart that, again, good little lesson about how is business conducted. And when you look at this, you realize that Venture Smith is operating in a very sophisticated kind of economy. And even though he appears, we don't know for sure, but he appears to have not had a formal education. He's clearly pretty smart, and because there's a lot of trying to figure out how to buy and sell things. There's a lot of bartering, there's book credit, bills of exchange, there's notes exchanged. And he tells some pretty compelling stories about this, including he loans money to the brother of one of his owners when he's still enslaved. And then when that relationship goes sour, the note gets torn up. And so essentially Venture loses all his money that he's loaned to this white man. So the next time he's got a bunch of money, he doesn't loan it out. He does end up loaning money as an important way and very sophisticated way to increase his own wealth. But at one point he just buries his money in the road because that's safer. So there's just, again, a lot of very interesting opportunities for discussion and understanding what life was like. And I always reflect how, like now, if my children were young now, they would never see cash come out of my purse. They would just see plastic. And when you think about Bitcoin and the ways I just wonder how kids will have any understanding of money at all, since so little of it is exchanged. So this kind of it's not too difficult to kind of connect this to what kids are experiencing today as the economy evolves sort of yet again. So we've got the book available again online, 108 pages. It's got a glossary, lots of text features, maps, charts. There's a great, I did a lot of research, for example, and there's a chart in there around when slavery was ended in all of the all New England states plus New York, which is not as easy as you would think to just say, oh, it was such and such a date here and such a date. Kind of complicated, very interesting. There's some census data charts. So there's lots and lots in the book, and I encourage you to get a sample of it. You can go to the website venturesmithcolonialct.org and sign up for a 7-day free trial, and then you just get access to everything to take a look. So I encourage you to do that. So you can get a free sample. You can get a hard copy through the website as well. So then since there's so much emphasis in Common Core and in the state curriculum standards around using primary sources, and Venture Smith is a primary source, but he's not the only one. And I really wanted to be able to represent multiple kinds of people. Those three main groups: the Puritans, the Native Americans, and the Africans and African Americans. I created this primary source library online. Now, this part of the site is free and open to all, and I welcome you to take a look at it. And I just wanted to talk about one or two documents. So I have a bunch of documents in there. A lot of times you'll see either a photograph, like you see here, an excerpt, or you'll see a transcription. And then I've tried to scaffold them by providing kind of a summary or some context, because again, we are theoretically dealing with fifth graders, and a lot of this language is completely impenetrable. So I've really tried to work hard to make it accessible. And so there's some maps on there. All of the laws about slavery from Connecticut are on this site. I hadn't seen the text of all of these myself, even though I've done obviously a lot of research around this. So this, to me, for any historian, is like a fantastic place to go and say, what was the text of that law in 1710? And even looking at the laws is a great inquiry, because kids would have to think about, okay, what do the laws say and what don't they say? And one of the important things they don't say in Connecticut is that slavery is actually legal in this state. There's also no law that prescribes, well, I wouldn't say no law, but very few laws that prescribe the actions or what a slave holder can do or not do. Most of them are laws around the rights and activities of enslaved people. And so what does that say about the colonial Connecticut government? What were they concerned about? What were they legislating? Who were they legislating? And it's pretty good to begin a basis of understanding about, well, a couple of different things. In history, we read what's written and you think about what's not written. But what was happening, what's implied or inferred, you have to be careful about that, of course. And you learn about what are the levers of power and who is in control and what. And all this, of course, circles back to the colonial economy and how the colonial economy develops. I also have on there some links to some other sites. So I also tried to bring in some other, it's on the African-American side, some other enslaved people. There's some excerpts from some really compelling excerpts from a narrative from another enslaved person named, and then he became free, Borrero Brinch. He also went by James Brace. He was enslaved in Milford, Connecticut, after serving as an enslaved person during the French and Indian War. And then he becomes free, but he serves in the Revolutionary War. And so he talks about being a soldier in the Revolutionary War. So again, Revolutionary War in Connecticut, you don't often hear the voices of an African or African-American fighting in that war, but there are quite a lot of African-Americans who fought in that war. And this but again, very few narratives, but this is a wonderful opportunity if you're looking at the American Revolution to there's a number of different examples you can draw from to get a different perspective for your students. And then I just wanted to point out this Mohegan Petition of 1789 because I'm reading Ronald Takaki's A Different Mirror, which I highly recommend. And he's talking about, in a section I was reading a little bit ago, about the Dawes Act of 1887, so not Connecticut and a century later. But that allowed for the government to allot reservation lands of Native Americans, Plains Indians, to individuals of that tribe the tribes in 160-acre tracts. And essentially in an effort to try to turn the Plains Indians into farmers, who improved the land alongside white farmers on the next 160-acre tract. Well, that exact same thing was happening in Connecticut in 1789, and here is a document that will tell you about this. This in the most beautiful language, just really poignant. The Mohegan are petitioning the state, the brand new state legislature. They have had to, and they describe their past, the way that they had lived communally, that they had gathered around one dish and one fire. So a beautiful metaphor about the communal way that they use the land, but that they've been fighting this and constant encroachment and by settlers on their land. And so they're asking the legislature to divide their land so that they would each have one dish and one fire. And this just is a really, I think, poignant and culminating document around the colonial British way of having come here and how land and property is really the basis of the colonial government. And yet, if you look at the Native American way and the documents, you understand that they had a completely different approach to how their society was formed and how they operated as a people and as a culture and as their own governing. So I encourage you to take a look at the primary source library as a very rich place for your students to do some additional, and say an inquiry product. So I'm going to swap it over now to Carol to really talk about the unit plan as she created it.
Okay, so we've already said what's on this first slide, that we have standards from both the social studies frameworks and the Connecticut core standards for ELA. So moving into the actual unit plan, our unit essential or compelling question, and we're not going to have the discussion right now about what's the difference, if any, but is, why is the story of Venture Smith important for us to understand today? And that really is the focus of the entire curriculum. And you'll see as we go through this that there are compelling questions for the different sections that all tie back to this essential question. When I work with teachers, I exhort them to have their essential question posted in their classroom the whole time that they are teaching a particular thing. And I think it's really critical to keep going back to this idea that we need to know about Venture Smith because it tells us something about who we are now and where we might be going now. And, you know, now more than ever, this is a really important story for us to tell. Okay, so for parts 1 and 2, I want to talk about the compelling questions and the unit goals. It is set up so that we have a compelling question and unit learning goals for each section of the book, and then it gets broken down further, as you'll see as we go on. So the compelling questions for the first 2 sections, which are Venture's story, are: how does Venture Smith's early life help us understand how slavery came to Connecticut? Which is really important because a lot of kids don't really think about slavery. A lot of adults don't really think about slavery as having been a New England thing. I think if you ask kids initial questions about slavery, they really almost always fall back to, well, that was in the South and that was why we fought the Civil War. But slavery was in Connecticut long before that. And then how does the story of Venture Smith's enslavement and quest for freedom help us understand the human impact of slavery? And that's what we want to keep going back to. So as a result of reading these first 2 sections, we want kids to be able to describe key events in Venture's life, all throughout his life. And then more importantly, to analyze what we learn from his enslavement, his struggle for freedom, and his life as a free man. And you see that really in detail as he is telling his story about what that struggle for freedom was after he was plucked from his life as a prince in a country in West Africa when he was 5 years old, and, you know, transported into this alternate reality. And then ultimately his life as a free man and how successful he was once he earned his own freedom, bought back the freedom of his family, and established himself in Connecticut. And then to evaluate the impact of Venture's point of view on our understanding of slavery and the founding of Connecticut. Then when we get to the history part of it, the compelling question for part 3 was, how is life in Connecticut, colonial Connecticut, different from life today? And we ask kids to do an actual comparison. There's a Venn diagram. I don't know what just happened. I got muted for some reason.
Sorry, that was me. Sorry.
Okay. So then our goals for this 3rd section are for kids to be able to describe how the relationships between the European settlers and the Native Americans changed as time went on, what the key events are in the history of colonial Connecticut, how the government was different and sometimes similar to government today, and then, as Elizabeth said, important aspects of the colonial economy. So you'll see from that we're really covering several different aspects of the frameworks. We're looking at economics, we're looking at government and civics, we're looking at history, we're looking at geography to a pretty good extent as we kind of trace Venture's journey. And then the last section, slavery in Connecticut, What does the history of slavery in Connecticut tell us about the origins? Sorry, I made a typo this morning. Origins of inequality in the United States. And that, to me, is a really, really important question. If we are looking at inequality now, how does what we learn about the history of slavery help us understand where that came from and why it is so entrenched? So in this, as a result of this section, kids will learn about the history of slavery in Connecticut and the laws that regulated the slave trade. They will be able to show what life is like for enslaved people in Connecticut. Venture talks a lot about his life and the life of various family members, and then analyze the reasons for the existence of slavery in Connecticut and the end of slavery in Connecticut. Why did it come here? Why did we eventually decide that it wasn't something we should be doing anymore? The reason that we did the 3 sections, and Elizabeth talked a little bit about this before, is that you could just do Venture Smith's story. It can stand on its own if you just wanted to talk about a personal narrative of an enslaved person in Connecticut. You hear his voice, you understand his story from his own words. You don't have to do anything with the historical background. But understanding the background of colonial Connecticut and the history of slavery in Connecticut certainly helps kids understand that story better. And I was saying to Elizabeth yesterday, when I was an English teacher, I always taught historical context when we were reading things that are clearly linked to what was happening at the time. So for example, when I taught Beowulf, we had to talk about the Anglo-Saxon period because kids didn't know anything about it and the story wouldn't have made any sense to them. And so my kids would always say, "This is not history class. Why are you teaching history?" And I would say, because history and literature go together hand in hand. So I feel very strongly, even though I was an English teacher, that it's really important to do all of these sections in order for Venture's narrative really to come to life. You can, and Elizabeth is right, I was the one that said, actually, she kind of alternated Venture's point of view with the historical part, and my feeling was that we just needed to see the whole story together, to hear Venture's words, and you could do the background stuff before you taught the narrative, you could do it after you taught the narrative, you could do it while you were teaching the narrative. It is totally flexible, and the way the curriculum is set up, it's very easy to go back and forth between the narrative and the history if that's the way you want to do it. So it really is a question of what works for you as a teacher and what you think will work for your students. What else do we have in this unit? This is a very, very complete thing. There are comprehension questions for every chapter, and we have included a triple entry reading journal as a possible way for kids to take notes as they are reading the chapters. And this is true both of Venture Story and of the historical stuff. We have suggested activities and you can use them or not use them, but activities that we think will really help to amplify what the kids are doing with the text itself. And then, as we said at the very beginning, the summative inquiry totally supports student choice and voice.
So we did pilot this in 7th grade, in East Haddam in the 7th grade, and Middletown in the 5th grade. And you will find some more quotes pulled from it was actually an inquiry project. The kids went through this whole curriculum and then read the book, and then they had to write me a letter and tell me what they liked about it and what I could improve. And we took their suggestions in a number of cases, and it was really helpful feedback. But you have 2 examples here, and you can find some more, as I say, on the Venture Smith Colonial Connecticut website. But I think I was most gratified to find that kids, both 5th graders and 7th graders, really found it as compelling a story as I did as an adult historian. And I think that really speaks to Venture's story and how he tells about his life. Do you want to add anything, Carol?
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to add is that the reason we did the pilot in East Haddam in 7th grade was that I happened to be consulting with East Haddam at the time, and I knew I could talk the teacher into doing it. But Venture Smith and his wife are buried in East Haddam, so for the kids in East Haddam, you know, they could practically walk from their school to where Venture Smith and his wife are buried, and it it was great to see how excited they were to find out about this real person who lived in their town at a time that they could not even imagine. Um, so that was really fun. And as Elizabeth said, the kids gave great feedback. I mean, one of the things that both the 5th graders and the 7th graders said was, you know, this book really needs a glossary. There are a lot of words in here that we don't know. And I had said, you know, somewhere along the way, maybe we should do a glossary, and then we kind of forgot it, and then we said, okay, we really have to do a glossary. So then of course that meant going back and finding all those words. But so now there's a glossary, and I was pretty gratified that kids even knew that a glossary is a good thing to have, because apparently they're paying more attention to text features than I thought they were.
And we also, we were a little concerned about whether a 5th grade, you know, what the reading level was like for the 5th graders. And so, and we obviously have a little more of an urban town here and a more of a rural town. But the teacher in Middletown, she had the students, I think she had them to kind of do a read aloud together in the classroom, but she did not express any concerns about the reading level with her kids. So that you know, that was an important thing to test it out with actual 5th graders. So I just wanted to say a few words about teaching difficult history, or at least the research I have done and how I've approached it, obviously as a white person, which is a very different, you know, it's not a universal perspective, obviously, by any means. And I had run across this quote by hip hop mogul Sean P. Diddy Combs, who's not somebody that I actually listen to his music, but obviously know who he is, you know, important person. And this quote really spoke to me. If you study Black history, it's just so negative. You know, it's just like, okay, we were slaves, and then we were whipped and sprayed with water hoses in the civil rights movement, and we're American gangsters. I get motivated for us to be seen in our brilliance. So one thing I appreciate about this is the way he has collapsed African-American history into this, you know, one statement. But it really speaks to the pain of this history, to the difficulty of this history. But for me, the touchstone is the last sentence. I get motivated for us to be seen in our brilliance. And in my study of history and African-American history, and one of the first really deep dives I did into it was co-publishing a book for adults, African-American Connecticut Explored, which came out in 2014. We did with the Amistad Center for Art and Culture. Published by Wesleyan University Press. If you don't have a copy, I encourage you to get one, because it provides, it's 50 essays by 30 scholars, the long arc of the African-American experience in Connecticut. It is not difficult to have to pull out the brilliance and have people seen in their brilliance. And I think the focus there is that's the touchstone for me. But I'm not representing that I speak for everybody by any means. There are some great resources. This is only 3. In the aspect of teaching about slavery, which is obviously an extremely difficult topic, Understanding and Teaching American Slavery is an excellent book. It's really geared towards high school and college level, but we've tried to pull in a document that comes with the curriculum that's much more extensive. We've tried to pull out some things, some guidance for when you're working with younger students. And then of course, Teaching Tolerance, program of the Southern Poverty Law Center at tolerance.org. They came out about a year ago with guidance and frameworks around teaching about slavery, and they have it scaffolded by grade levels. So you can look at the younger grade levels, or whatever grade level you're teaching, for understanding what concepts and themes and messages are appropriate for that age group. And this Race, the Power of Illusion, PVP at PBS, a 3-part documentary I recommend. But of course, there's a lot of resources out there now, which is wonderful, and we need to avail ourselves of them. But generally, pulling from those sources, I just always suggest starting by acknowledging that this is difficult history, and history is difficult. I mean, and a lot of people will say, oh, history is always told by the victor. Well, that's not the kind of history we're interested in. I mean, I'm not interested in it, but that's not the type of history we're talking about anymore. We are talking about really exploring history from a lot of different multiple perspectives, and those perspectives are going to have some challenges to them for sure. So we need to just acknowledge our feelings. We need to be able to sit in our discomfort. We have to acknowledge that no one in your classroom is responsible. There should be no blaming or shaming. But we are responsible for understanding, and we are responsible for working towards a more equitable and humane society that respects all human rights. And it starts with really understanding our history and building that understanding and empathy. And so we have to mourn. We must mourn and be sorry for those who were harmed and whose lives were ended due to the cruelty of slavery and war. And that's just the truth. So what not to do? You have all heard the horrifying stories of teachers who have gotten in trouble for doing the wrong thing in the classroom. Basically, no role playing or using games to teach students about difficult history. There's a lot of interest in gamifying curriculum, and that sounds pretty fun in other contexts, but not here. And at no time should any students be asked to place themselves in the role of. There's just no role of an enslaved person or a slave owner, or to calculate the value of or act out any exchange of an enslaved person. Just again, keeping the humanity of each child, each student, and each person in history front and center is just the most important thing. And I do say, just to resist the impulse to make any of this history less awful, but instead to focus on the humanity, the agency, the resistance of the people who were wronged in our history. Each of these, and this again, Venture Smith, he is a person. He is a person with feelings, with a history, with values, with a culture that is never eradicated from him. He carries that with him through his whole life, and that's, I just think, one of the most important lessons you maybe can take out of this, that people in history, they're not just people on a page. They were living, breathing, feeling, loving people. So I think that's kind of what we've got. Yeah, we can take questions. We have a few minutes. And I guess that would be in the Q&A, or in the, I guess I'm going to stop screen sharing maybe.
Individuals can also unmute themselves and ask.
Oh, okay. I have to figure out how to unscreen share.
I have a question.
Yes.
Just a early Connecticut history question. We're a pretty small geographical state, and we're then obviously too, but were there areas of Connecticut that were more pockets of where more pockets of slavery was common, or was it pretty much geographically spread throughout the state?
It was spread across the state and pretty widely dispersed, but really New London ends up being the county with the largest number of enslaved people, I think because it is a port city. There's some evidence of some larger, so I want to say sort of farms with larger numbers of enslaved people in Eastern Connecticut. And we have a couple of examples cited in the book, like Pomfret and maybe Lebanon, where there might have been as many as 25 enslaved people. But usually in other places around the state, it's 1 or 2 enslaved people in a professional family home, like home of a professional, like a minister, which always shocks people, or because it really gets right to the root of, wait a second, what about the moral question of slavery? Ministers and merchants and lawyers and that kind of thing. And as later into the after this book ends, because this is really the colonial period, but in the early Republic period, there begins to be some consolidation in some communities, or a little bit more urban, although Deep River ends up with a sizable African American community, Bridgeport and New Haven and such.
Thank you.
I think it's a wonderful way in which you capture a lot of different histories, a lot of different points of view, a lot of different types of ways to tackle the all-inclusive culture and experience, the colonial experience. I think it's a wonderful way to do this with the lens of an individual, noting the importance of that history is a story of individuals, and I think that's a wonderful way to do it. You had mentioned that there was a source, and it was quick. It was a series of essays by African-American authors. Could you?
No, the book I was talking about is called African American Connecticut Explored. I should actually have a flyer of that up on our exhibit. Came out in 2014, Wesleyan University Press, and you could also find information about that on Connecticut Explored's website. But it was a book we did collaboratively with the Amistad Center for Art and Culture, where we gathered 50 essays by 30 scholars about, and really the long arc of the African American experience. So it begins in this early period, colonial period, and goes right up into the 20th century, and includes a lot of different stories about different aspects and different people, important African Americans. Not complete by any means, because when could it ever be complete and not be, a tome, a multi-volume series. And we also, on our website, Connecticut Explored, ctexplored.org, we have a teacher page, a section, and we have gathered all of our stories about African American history into one topic page on that site. We have more than 70 or 75 stories, plus a bunch of podcasts from Grading the Nutmeg that again cover just all kinds of, it's a wonderful resource, especially for older students, not so much fifth grade, but just if they're interested in exploring, inventors and business people and, communities, activists, the whole politicians, the whole thing.
I wanted to actually go back to something that Nora said and just point out that, we talk all the time about depth over breadth in teaching social studies and how challenging that is, because social studies teachers kind of have a propensity to think that every single thing that ever happened was important. I think this book and this curriculum give you an opportunity to take a really deep dive into something while framing it in a broader context, so that you get both. You get depth and you get breadth, and so it gives you an opportunity in a relatively short period of time to cover a fair amount of history at the same time that you are really looking deeply into the history of one person. So I think that's one of the things that I really like about the book and about the curriculum that we developed to go with it.
So I see Melissa House on the call here from Keeler Tavern, so I want to give a shout out to her and some of the others in our history field, because they've been doing some really important work, and you can find educational resources there on their website as well. So look to the history community, particularly in your own town, and see if they have started to create some curriculum and educational materials around the colonial period and around multiple perspectives in your own town.
I think we might have time for one more question.
I have a question, but can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi. My question is, was there any intersectionality with the tobacco story in Connecticut, the Venture Smith story on tobacco?
Well, I think tobacco as an industry really gets started quite a bit later. And so I don't believe tobacco is a particular product in the colonial period. It definitely becomes an important product in the 20th century, maybe even
later. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Connecticut's economy in the colonial period really is it's really connected to the triangle trade and to colonial and to the Caribbean, and particularly food, growing and shipping foodstuffs and other supplies to the Caribbean, and also kind of a coastal, it's a very much of a maritime economy, which is very interesting. And Venture Smith's story talks about that too, because he spends time on Long Island and Fisher's Island and Rhode Island. And so again, it talked about geography and economy and how it all connects together.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth and Carol, for presenting to us the colonial history from Venture Smith's perspective. I think that was really enlightening, and it has a lot of possibilities in many different districts and even high school levels.